Hello and welcome to the first edition of a new playlist for this YouTube channel, and it's going to be entitled The Book Club, because what I'm going to do is review books that I've been reading over the years that I have thought are particularly pertinent for all the things that I've been doing and that I've been trying to focus on. Today, the first installment of this book club is going to review a book was written by Ed Yong, who is a science writer for Atlantic magazine. And actually, he did a yeoman's job during the pandemic in that he together with Catherine Wu, another science writer for Atlantic, I think did the best reporting on in real time as to what was going on with the pandemic and the virus and the immune response and the vaccines and the whole thing. So I really respect this fellow, Ed Yong. Before we get started, don't forget to like the video if you do, and click on the bell and get notified for more. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Click on my website to get other further information. Scroll down on the YouTube site to get all the social media hookups and so forth. So this book, I have to show it to you here, An Immense World by Ed Yong. And then the subtitle is How Animal Senses Reveal the Hidden Realms Around Us. And I learned a lot in this book. I rarely read a whole book or buy a whole book these days. Everything I read goes onto my Amazon Kindle so that I can read it at 3 a.m. when I can't sleep. But I had to run out and buy this volume after I read the whole book on Kindle because of the fact that I said, this is a very good contribution to this gestalt of where we are, all the things in our world that we experience all the time and don't really think about because we're so narcissistic in our approach to life. And humans are just the best thing going, and we're the top of the ladder of evolution and so forth and so on. Some people have told us. What the book is about how varied the abilities of the different species of animals that are on our planet sense the world around them. And it's really an addition to Charles Darwin's The Origin of the Species and Natural Selection, because in each and every instances, what Ed Yong goes through in this book is he points out that different animals, over the millennia, over the millions of years, have evolved different senses. They've taken the same thing, they sense in sort of the major things that we sense as well, but they've taken them and they've used them for what they need them for, not necessarily what we need them for. And of course, as he goes into, the sight is so overwhelming in terms of our view of the world. It's not surprising that there's this diversity in all of the animals and how they sense the world and what they sense in the world, because they've all come from different time, different place, and they've used whatever they've needed in order to survive. And so therefore there's a lot of senses that have to do with food, sex, and survival from predators, stands to reason. So in the introduction of this book, Ed goes into, he defines a word that hasn't been in sort of the lexicon of most people's vocabulary. It's called Umwelt, spelled UMWELT. It was defined in 1909 by Jacob von Uexküll. He defined it as the perceptual world of each of the different species. In other words, what they detect or what they sense of the world around them. And he introduces the concept of detecting different stimuli in the environment via receptors. And of course, in immunology, I've spent in my entire career working on receptors and how they work and what they do and so forth. So this was sort of like, well, what else is new? But the thing is that all of the stimuli that a particular animal enters into their Umwelt is dealt with and utilized. And the thing about this stimuli is that ultimately the receptors detect it on the one hand, but also then they change it. They transduce it, as we call signal transduction in my business, they transduce this into information that very often, if not always, is dealt with by the nervous system of the animal. Now, receptors themselves, as this is all in the intro, are molecules. Molecules are defined as two or more atoms bonded together chemically. So molecules that are part of the organism detect a stimulus and then change that stimulus into information that the animal utilizes. The nervous system of the animal, the brains of the animal, process the stimuli that they have received and organize it so that they could be utilized. And that's sort of the major or the fundamental aspect of this book. Aristotle was a pretty smart guy. Back more than 2,000 years ago, he described what were called the five senses of humans. And he assumed that other animals had the same five senses, essentially. And they include sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. And he missed proprioception, which is the ability to detect how the organism is how the body of the organism is organized in space. And the other sense that Aristotle did not deal with was equilibrioception, which is balance in terms of the ability of the organism to maintain a particular stance within the environment. So now the bulk of the book, which is quite a tome, essentially, the bulk of the book is organized by the specific stimuli, like light or sound and that sort of thing. And there's a chapter on all of the major stimuli that go into making up this whole thing. And chapter 1 deals with sort of which I think is sort of the most logical sensing that we could deal with, that deals with smell and taste. And he points out that these are senses of chemical stimuli. Chemical molecules bind to receptors that are then taken by the animal and transduced into information that is utilized. So he begins with dog smells. And I don't know whether you have had a dog or watched other people walk their dog, but there's always a struggle going on between the dog and the person walking the dog, because the person walking the dog just wants to get this over with, usually wants to get this over with as fast as possible so they can go back to doing whatever they were doing. But the dog has finally been let out of the purgatory of the inside of the house and is confronted with a myriad of smells that are out there. And he's just, he or she is just happy as a clam and just would like to just stay in one little spot, smelling all the different kinds of smells that are there. We've always known that dogs are really good smellers, for example. I mean, the little beagles in the airports that are smelling all the hard drugs that are coming in through the equatorial countries. And also the dogs are used to detect truffles that are buried underneath the trees in France and Italy and other places where the dogs can find them. And pigs were originally used for this, but dogs evidently are, I don't know, easier to train, and so they've supplanted the pigs in this profession. The dogs appear to be better smellers. And what Ed Yong does in all of these chapters is that he tells stories about the experiments that have been done to establish whatever the questions are. And the nice thing about this book, one of the things I liked about it, is that Ed Yong, the author, has interviewed all of the scientists who have contributed to this book, and he names the scientists. So often in science and in school, you're as a student, you're confronted with a paragraph about this long that probably condenses 100 years of science into a factoid that you have to then regurgitate on the next test. And the student gets the idea that facts just appear out of nowhere. They take the people out of the science. Ed Yong doesn't do that. He puts the people right there in each of the paragraphs and chapters, and you get a sense of the kinds of people and the kinds of experiments that these people have done in order to add to our knowledge about exactly what's going on. The other thing that's quite evident about this treatment in this book is that we are so fortunate today because we stand on not only 1,000 years of accumulation of knowledge about the world around us, but we stand on all of the physics and chemistry and biology that's accumulated in the last 200 years, and particularly in the last 100 years. And so there's a wealth of information that's out there, a lot of which is contained in this book with regard to how we and other species sense our environment that just simply wasn't there before. And the scientists that Ed talks about are the ones that have created this knowledge, this new knowledge, which is really what science is all about. And they go early on in this particular chapter on smell and then taste, the concentration of the chemical that's being detected is important, and the characteristics of the receptor molecules that detect these molecules do so by binding to they call them odorants, and if you're talking about smell, so that there's a threshold of concentration of the odorant that needs to occur before it can bind to the receptor, and that is dependent on the fact that there is a certain affinity of the receptor for the odorant. And the higher the affinity, the lower the concentration of the odorant is detectable. The thing about dogs is that they have more receptors than we do, so they can detect more molecules. They also have each cell that has the receptor on the cell surface. There's more of them in dogs than there are in humans, for example. And so, and the receptors are found, the receptor molecules are found on neurons that are in the mucosa of the nasal passages, and they are hardwired back into the nervous system that ultimately goes back to a certain area of the brain which detects these, which detects the stimuli and transduces it into information that we then understand that this is a good smell or that's a bad smell, and so forth. And smell goes to the forebrain, whereas taste goes to the hindbrain, down in the nitty-gritty places of the hindbrain. So there's several different stories that Ed tells in all of these different chapters about different species and their capacities and abilities to either go beyond what a human could ever taste or detect. And of course, we know that with regard to smell, they have more of the detectors and more of the detecting molecules per detector, and they have they have a whole different umwelt, a whole different ability to enjoy and detect the environment. Taste is a similar but different kind of sense, and it's usually tied to different aspects of food, so that the animal understands and detects what's available. And so in humans, there's 5 different receptors. There is a receptor for sodium or salt, one for sweetness, one for bitterness, one for sour, and one for what the Japanese called umami, which is a savory, and that's for amino acids, and it's usually glutamic acid that is really triggers this particular receptor. He points out that different species, such as reptiles and birds, which are dinosaurs essentially, and mammals, they all taste with their tongues, and insects, for example, have taste receptors on different body parts, like their feet and their legs when they touch the food that they are walking on. And one of the little anecdotes that I thought was really interesting was catfish are described as essentially swimming tongues. Because they have receptors all over their bodies for tasting the molecules in the environment. And dinosaurs and consequently a fair number of birds, songbirds in particular, do not detect sweetness. The salt and sour, salt being sodium and sour being acid, hydrogen ions, these tastes are detected by ion channels that open or close, and they can detect the concentration readily of these different aspects of things. Whereas sweet, bitter, and umami are detected by tastes of these things, are tested by a particular class of receptors that were well known in biology now called GPCRs, and that stands for G protein coupled receptors. These receptors are morphologically seven loops through the membrane of a cell, and they are coupled on the inside to a G protein, which then transduces the signal beyond. And so as many as 50% of the drugs in the pharmacopoeia right now have been developed to deal with G protein coupled receptors, either to block them or to activate them, and so forth and so on. So they're very, very important for biology and also for pharmacology. The other thing that they've pointed out in this particular chapter is that carnivores, such as cats, and I have a cat, which I really like, this cat, they don't have sweet receptors. Why would they, right? Because they've been selected over the millennia to be meat eaters, essentially. You don't need to be detecting the sweets. And so one of the things that I've done to maintain my cat's body weight is to put that cat on a low carbohydrate diet. It took me a while to find that, because if you look at the ingredients of the different pet foods that are on the market, they're all chock full of grains, which is starch, because it's cheap. Carnivores really don't need to have starch and sugar in their diet. So that's in the initial chapter. And then I just want to go over a couple of other chapters. This book is like an encyclopedia. And so it's chock full of information. And I think it's going to be ultimately, at least in my office, on my desk, it's going to be a reference if I want to find out about these different kinds of things. And the other thing about this book is it's got a fantastic bibliography where if you want to go to the primary literature, you can. So chapter 2 is about light. Right off, they say, okay, so what is light? And of course, the physicists have told us that it's an electromagnetic wave, and it's also a particle of energy called a photon. And the waves that exist out there that we've identified, from the low frequency and long wavelength of radio waves, microwaves, infrared waves, visible light, ultraviolet light, X-rays, and gamma rays with the highest frequency and the shortest wavelengths. That's the light portion of that electromagnetic spectrum is what our eyes detect. And they don't do infrared, for example. We learned about the new telescope that's just gone up that is detecting infrared wavelengths that we haven't been able to see with our light telescopes, for example. Our eyes contain photoreceptors that are called opsins, lo and behold, which are just like the taste receptors. There's 7 transmembrane G protein coupled receptors. These and they're called opsins, which is a contraction of rhodopsin. And these opsins contain a chromophore, a chromophore of the small molecule, which is chemically bonded to the larger opsin molecule, the 7-transmembrane receptor. And when light hits that chromophore, it changes its configuration and changes the configuration of the G protein coupled receptor. And that initiates then the detection and the signal transduction of the light from the opsin back through the optic nerves to the portion of the brain that actually then detects that signal. Every animal that sees through this mechanism. So it's what we use. All the rest of the animals that have been studied they do the same thing. There are major differences in the different animals because they use this system to there's two different aspects of the sight and the light is the acuity and the sensitivity. And these two aspects are sort of fighting amongst one another. All of the different G protein coupled receptors that are in nature have been traced through a series of experiments that were, I'm sure, quite laborious to a single ancestral gene. But of course, there's more than 1,000 of these site opsins. And each one of them is different and used differently by different species of animals, and therefore they see things differently than we do. And they can also see in not only in the visible spectrum, but in the other parts of the spectrum as well. Now, in addition to there are two different kinds of these kinds of receptors. There's the rods, which have these opsins. And then there's the cones, and the cones are similar, but they are responsible for detecting color. And different animals are good or not so good at detecting different colors and so forth. And he goes into all of that business. And throughout the rest of the book, and I'm not going to go into all of it because I'd be here for a long, long time, the other senses that are discussed in this book are pain, heat, sound, echoes that the bats used, for example, and electric fields. And finally, it goes into one that I thought was one of the most interesting to me, were magnetic fields, or the magnetic field that is in the Earth. Because the Earth's core is a solid iron sphere, which is surrounded by molten iron and nickel. The movement of the liquid portion of the center of the Earth turn the whole planet into a giant bar magnet. So that's why compasses have allowed us to determine the north versus south and so forth, and then been able to navigate when we've been wandering around our globe. The geomagnetic field doesn't change over time, number one. Number two, the geomagnetic field and the waves from this geomagnetic field go right through our matter and our bodies and so forth. It really envelops the entire planet, but it has been utilized by different species of animals who have undergone migrations across the planet and actually spanning different continents. And this is one of the things, and one of my pet peeves. I have a T-shirt that says, "Instinct is a myth." You know, what scientists have done over the few hundred years that they've been thinking about these sorts of things, when they come across a behavior of an animal like the salmon who returns to its birthplace upstream to spawn, they haven't been able to figure that out. So they've said, well, this is due to instinct. Well, then if you look up the word instinct, it's then described as an innate, inborn sense, ultimately thought to be genetically or hereditarily determined. But as far as the phenomenology of, or the biochemistry or the molecular biology of that has not been determined. Well, of course, sea turtles, for example, undergo a whole migration pattern, as do whales, as another species. And they have done experiments with different species who seem to have had to use this electromagnetic or geomagnetic sense to find out whether or not they really are. And one of the ways they've done that is to put the animal in a controlled environment and then change the magnetism that it's exposed to. And when it does that, the animal changes together with the magnetism, so that all of the information that is available now indicates that there is some way that these animals are sensing the magnetism, but there's never been a receptor that's been identified. And so there's more yet to do. We need to do more experiments. And that I will stop there. I recommend you buy this book, read the book, and put it on your bookshelf and use it as the reference book for so many things that have not been described. It's really a tour de force. So I'll stop there. Thanks for listening, and come back again for the next installment of the book club. If you're new to immunology, or you just want to delve into a certain aspect of this large field, and you want to get a grasp on things, you should buy my new book, Molecular Immunity, because it's a chronology of all of the important experiments and discoveries that have been made in the last 60 years. It's concise, but it's also very comprehensive. And it's the only such book that's been written since 1970. So you can buy it on Amazon, and together with the YouTube videos of the Classics in Immunology Journal Club, you can't go wrong.